Well, we left the narrative just as Jesus was being arrested, and so we now take you into the next phase, and it all gets a bit tense and a little bit graphic. I won't overplay it, but when we come to the crucifixion, we do well to know something about what a crucifixion is, but that's how I won't be too graphic, but we can't take anything away from our Lord's suffering. So the next step is what is called the Jewish inquiries and the Roman trials, and they are distinct. And I'm going to make the point probably more than once that the Jews did not hold a trial. That might have happened later if things hadn't gone their way, but we'll see exactly what that means. There were actually two court systems that were operating in Jerusalem, what's known as the Sanhedrin, and they were allowed to look after the Jewish religious law, of which there was a considerable amount, and also some minor civil disputes. As opposed to the Romans, they looked after the big stuff in terms of civil disputes and also criminal law, because they had more sanctions that they could employ. We talk about the Sanhedrin. Translation of the word Sanhedrin is sitting together. That's what it means. And in fact, in every town, there were 3 judges appointed on behalf of the Sanhedrin, and they would consider most of the cases, which were sort of domestic disputes or disputes over property, monies, contracts, that sort of thing. And they would look after that, and what they said would go. But the more serious cases would need to be heard by a Sanhedrin, and that consisted of 23 members. When you get to Jerusalem, if there was something really big going on, then the full council could be called, which was 3 Sanhedrins, so that makes a total of 69, and then the high priest would also sit with them to chair it in consultation. So that's the Sanhedrin, and it's in front of that Sanhedrin that Jesus was required to appear. And as I say, this hearing did not constitute a trial. They wanted to conduct inquiries to establish if there was a case which they would have to try themselves, or whether, and this is what they were hoping, they could offload it onto Pilate. I think it's called passing the buck, but they had to do it through certain procedures. They didn't want a trial. At least they didn't want them, Sanhedrin, the high priest, to hold a trial if they could avoid it. Because what they wanted was Jesus' death. And they did not have the power under Roman occupation to execute other than one thing, and this was really pushing it. If they could demonstrate blasphemy, then the law allowed them to stone the person to death. They didn't want to do that, because then they would be held accountable by the people. They would be the ones that caused the death and had executed. They would much rather the Romans take it on from here. But they had to, first of all, examine, inquire, and they had some specific things. Just before we get to that, let's just mention a bit about the priestly families and who was actually in control there. This goes back to Herod the Great, back to, he died in 4 BC, so we're going back to the time of Jesus' birth, in fact. And one of the things Herod the Great did was to bring in his choosing, not the people's choosing, and no other right other than his word, got 4 different families, or houses if you like, involved in running the temple and all the religious activities which were Jerusalem-based. And they have the names of the houses: Ishmael, Phoebe, Captros, and Hannon. Believe you me, in the same way as Herod himself was an outsider and distrusted and despised and feared by the people, so the appointed high priests and their acolytes were distrusted. And now, under Roman rule, they were not only seen as outsiders, but as collaborators and corrupt. Everyone was on the take. And being able to snuggle up to the Romans so that you worked with them, even if you resented their presence, but were willing to work with them, then there was probably something in it for you. At the time we're talking about, it was very much a family business, what I call the temple mafia. And it goes back a couple of generations in the family. Eleazar was the father of Annas. Hebrew name actually is Hanon, and one of the families I mentioned earlier. Annas was still referred to in the scriptures as the high priest because the title is given for life, but he became so frail and a little bit unreliable that he handed on responsibility to his sons. In fact, I think 5 of them had a go at being high priest, none of them very successfully. So Annas was still around, and of course he's referred to, and Jesus is referred to him during the inquiries and what goes on before the crucifixion. So he's very much in the picture, but a very elderly man, very frail. He had a daughter, and this daughter married Caiaphas. So Caiaphas, still keeping it in the family, was son-in-law of Annas. Just to give you an idea of how these high priests were viewed, this is quotation from a contemporary Jewish writing. Woe is me because of your incantations, woe is me because of your pen, woe is me because of your beating people with clubs. That's what someone had the nerve to write at the time. Signed Anon. Oh yes, it's anonymous. Not surprisingly. In other words, you're having a go and say, your prayers don't mean anything, it's just words. You sign things, don't trust you. And you are cruel to the people that you're supposed to be serving. That's how they felt about them. These outsiders, these collaborators, these corrupt people who were running a business in the temple. So we come to, well, what were they doing when they had Jesus brought to them? Not a trial, but inquiries. Let's go through it. They had 6 concerns. Did he speak against the law of Moses? That would be serious. Did he speak against the Sabbath? Did he heal by sorcery? Did he speak against the temple? That would really irk them. Did he commit blasphemy? Now, that's one. We could actually see the end of him through that, but we don't want to do it ourselves. Was he a false Messiah? Messiahs popped up at regular intervals. But you had to be careful, because the Messiah was expected, was longed for, was looked for. Be careful before you put the label false on somebody too early. Watch and wait. So what was the response from those inquiries? Well, first of all, did he speak against the law of Moses? Well, no, he didn't. In fact, he was explicit. I did not come to destroy the law. Did he speak against the Sabbath? That's a tricky one because the chief priests would have been divided on that. There were 2 schools, the Shammai and the Hillel. Shammai, they were the conservative ones, and they wouldn't, for example, allow you to do anything on the Sabbath. The Hillel were a bit more liberal, and remember that incident where Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field and they pick up some grain and just sort of crush it, yes, and eat it. Well, that was all right as far as the Hillels were concerned. They said you can't take a sickle to the crop, but you can pick up the odd few grains and crush them in your hands. That's all right. So they couldn't agree amongst themselves. So that was going to be a problem. What about sorcery? Again, they were undecided on this because certainly he had healed. The people saw it as a miracle, a gift from God. They would have liked it to be very clear that it was by sorcery. There were plenty of people, phony healers around. They would like to have labelled him with that, but they couldn't really have a convincing argument. So that was left in the air as well. Did he speak against the temple? Well, no. In fact, his whole activity, where he saw just how they had abused the temple, turning over the money changers and throwing out the people from selling the gifts and so on. No, he honoured the temple. This is my Father's house. Couldn't possibly have spoken against the temple. And that just left us with a couple, which are perhaps the most serious ones. Did he commit blasphemy? Well, they concluded that he claimed an authority equal to God. But would that actually hold up? And was he a false Messiah? Again, they didn't know yet. He might be a Messiah, the Messiah. They didn't know. That was the dilemma they had. All those 6 concerns, which they'd got together in a nice, neat list. And as they went through them, they realized that their arguments were getting weaker and weaker in most cases. So the outcome was inconclusive. Plan B kicks in. By taking 2 of the accusations and reframing them, then they could go to the Romans and ask them to have a look at it. If instead of Messiah and blasphemy, we talk in terms of sedition and planning a coup, the Romans will listen to that. That would certainly be of interest. Over to you, Pontius Pilate. So would you like to meet Marcus Pontius Pilatus? There he is. He was a prefect or governor of Judea for 10 years, from 26 to 36. He actually didn't live in Jerusalem, didn't like Jerusalem. It was too troublesome. There were too many Jews there for a start. He didn't like that. So he was down on the seaside, Caesarea, one of the nice fortresses that Herod the Great had built. And that was 2 days' march away. So if there was trouble, he could take his time getting to Jerusalem. Hopefully it'll all calm down by the time he got there. He could issue a few punishments and then go back and have a paddle in the sea. But he did turn up at Jerusalem when things got a bit tense, and that was when people were flocking in to Jerusalem for the major festivals, because the important thing was that peace must be maintained. Rome was looking at him. There's a bit of previous with Pilate as far as the emperor and others in the Senate were concerned. He had to demonstrate that he could keep the peace in this remote part of their empire. Remember, some way away. Interestingly, as you see, he overlapped with Caiaphas the high priest for 10 years. Oh, they got on together very well. Mutual back scratching, I think, was the way of describing that. They looked after each other, and a certain amount of coinage probably moved in different directions to ensure that was maintained. Okay, we're now in the Roman court. This is a court. What are their concerns? 3 concerns. Did Jesus forbid tribute to Rome? Did he incite the crowds to riot? Was he plotting a coup? Well, let's look at those 3 in turn. Did he forbid tribute to Rome? No. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Very clear statement. The chief priests knew that. They'd heard it. In fact, they tried to trip him up, hadn't they, with that one? Second one. Did he incite the crowds to riot? Well, no, he didn't. But he could be a threat to peace. Because although he didn't incite the crowds, maybe others in the crowds would stir things up. You know what it's like when there are protests. We see it in our cities. Most people are peacefully protesting, singing, shouting, having a bit of a good time, as well as making their point. And then you get a faction, don't you, who stir things up. That's the problem. So Jesus may not have been the cause of a riot, but something, his presence, his activity, could have triggered it in others. Let's just keep that one open. Was he plotting a coup? Possibly, in the eyes of Pilate. What was it that went on Palm Sunday, as we call it? What was going on there? That was a bit uncomfortable. We had to have extra guards on duty round the walls, watching, waiting. It could have got out of hand. Was that the beginning of something bigger that could spill over? Let's wait and watch. But most of all, with all this, Pilate needed to get it right. And getting it right meant only one thing in the eyes of Rome. Keep the peace. If he could not keep the peace, he was out of a job, and possibly worse, because of, as I say, a bit of previous. We now have this sort of impasse. Everyone is sort of waiting on the other person. Who will make the decision? The Sanhedrin has passed the buck to Pilate. He now passes it to Herod Antipas. That's one of Herod the Great's sons. Herod had oversight of the Galilee. Jesus was from Galilee, and Herod was in town. Herod was actually in Jerusalem. How convenient was that? So, Jesus is packed off to see Herod Antipas. That doesn't go well at all. If you read the scriptures, Herod threw a series of questions at Jesus, and Jesus remained silent. Herod had no authority. Herod was not going to be making the final decision. Herod actually was intrigued by Jesus. Also, I think he was a bit nervous. This is the same Herod who had John the Baptist killed. And that had not been forgotten by the people of Galilee, amongst others. And Jesus, he was even more than John the Baptist. So Herod was in awe of him, but also afraid, and was not one who was going to make any decisions which could backfire. So we've got this uneasy collusion between Herod, between the chief priests, between Pilate. They're all looking at each other, and they may be agreed on the desired outcome. What was the easiest solution? Get rid of this man. Why are we standing around discussing? Just get rid of him. That was probably in their minds, but they couldn't just, as it were, sign the death warrant. So we come to the decision. Let the people decide. The people, of course, in the temple had vested interests. The members of the Sanhedrin, a few of them, of course, supported Jesus, followed him, were converted. Then there were the people, the market traders, who'd been enraged by Jesus' action. There were others who might well have followed for the sake of following the chief priest, because it was easier to say, yes, we'll follow you, and do as you say. Maybe, we don't know, some were even bribed when it came to make the decision, which was between Jesus and Barabbas. Barabbas, according to Matthew's Gospel, was a notorious prisoner. Luke refers to him as in prison with rebels, and there for murder. John calls him a bandit. And the people decided, on behalf of everyone else, that it should be Jesus who dies and Barabbas be released. And so we move, with that decision being made, to to the way of the cross, but not before scourging. That is a picture of a scourge, and if you had that, you were lucky. Because that one you can see is essentially a handle with some ropes on it and some knots in it. Not pleasant, but that's not what they used. That's what they used. Wooden handle, leather strap, and on those branches you will see bits of sheep bone, bits of metal, bits of lead included at the end, and it's that which they used to scourge. You can read up what scourging involved. Essentially, it takes the flesh off the back. People died, many people died, during or as a result of scourging. If there was nothing else following that, they were just given scourging as a punishment because of the state they were left in and the loss of blood or the infection that got into the wounds. They would die miserably. And so we come to the crucifixion. Please set aside any traditional pictures of a nice, neat, perfectly fashioned cross. You didn't waste good wood on a cross of execution. I mean, people didn't have tables and chairs made of wood. They certainly weren't going to use it as an execution place. Execution by crucifixion was usually like that, with a detachable beam, and that was fixed, when required, to either a post or, as you see here, a tree, and a footrest or saddle halfway down, just there. So this is detachable, and the condemned person would carry that. In Jesus' case, he was too weak to carry it, and someone carried it for him. Taken to the place of execution. And so we see there the trees or posts and the crossbar carried, which was reusable. You'll notice also that a sign is put up there, and you're familiar with that sign. And Pilate ensured it was in 3 languages. So it was in the language of the people, it was in the legal language of Latin, and it was in the most common language of Greek. And it said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. You may recognize that on some items in churches or near churches, the letters INRI, and that's the initial letters of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews in Latin. There's no J, of course, in Latin, just an I. So, Jesus Nazarenas Rex Iudeorum. What's important is that the sign is not the title of the person. The sign is the statement of the crime the person committed. And of course, the Pharisees were infuriated by this. They said, shouldn't you part be putting, he claimed to be the King of the Jews. No, what I've written, I've written. His crime was to be the King of the Jews. Roman occupation, there was only one person you looked to, that was the emperor, other than people we as Romans appointed. His crime was to be the King of the Jews. There's a deliberate, I think in Pilate's case, a deliberate ambiguity that he has put there. And it didn't make the chief priests at all pleased with him. Come to the final indignity. The victim had all clothing removed. When we see pictures of the crucifixion, there's usually a garment draped around Jesus's below the waist. No, they were being totally stripped and then fixed to the cross, to the tree. Clothing was claimed by the soldiers. The 4 items they shared between them were the sandals, his outer robe, the belt, and a turban. And then you had this seamless tunic. And they didn't want to rip it up, So remember, they cast lots for it. And so to the crucifixion itself. The victim was secured by rope or nails, or a combination of the two. Those nails were about 5 or 6 inches long, and archaeologists have found a skeleton, and in the ankle of the skeleton there's still a nail of somebody that was executed by crucifixion. The reason it's still there is that as the nail went through, it must have hit something, perhaps a knot or something in the wood of the tree, and it got bent right round at right angles. So when the victim was taken down, they couldn't get the nail out without ripping his body. So we have an example, which I won't show you, of a nail used in crucifixion. The victim's agony could be viewed at close quarters, not perched up way high, but no, just above eye level. You could see at close quarters what the poor person was going through. And yes, it was traditional that friends or family would offer some vinegar to help dull the pain on a hyssop branch, about 15 or 20 inches long, so just to hold it up for them. The actual cause of death, well, the weight of the body pulls on the arms, and as fatigue takes over, the victim cannot lift their body to breathe. There's exposure to the sun, loss of blood, from the scourging, of course, and also from the wounds inflicted by the nails. Death was usually by asphyxiation, but it was slow, it was lingering, it was agonizing. And as we know, and this is recorded in the scriptures, death could be hastened by breaking the legs at the knee. Jesus was already dead, so that didn't happen to him. It was known as the mercy stroke. And at Jesus' crucifixion, time was running out. They had to make sure he was dead and buried before sunset, before the start of the Sabbath. And so we've reminded, as we ponder on that picture of the crucifixion and of our Lord's body being taken down, that his body was broken for you, and his blood was shed for you. And so, friends, we have now come and completed our week, a week which took us from Bethany to Calvary, and we've reached the Friday, the Good Friday. But Sunday's coming. Easter Day is coming. Thank you very much. A little postscript. You want to know more about that? I'm afraid it's going to be me again, but don't worry. Maundy Thursday. St Michael's Church. We've got an event, starts at 7 o'clock. You're all most welcome to come. It will be built around communion service, around remembering the Last Supper, but with a number of other activities to go within that act of worship together. You're all most welcome. And at 4 o'clock, I'm on time again. How about that?